Thanks, Kath, and it's great to be here in this old hall. I think it's many years since I've been in here, actually, and also to be sharing the event with Daryl Taylor, who initiated some public speaking events in the aftermath of the Black Saturday fires between myself and Joan Webster, who I'd also want to acknowledge as someone locally who is, of course, really Australia's foremost bushfire communicator. She, as a journalist working with CSIRO in 1964, coined the term stay and defend or leave early to encapsulate the dynamic of decision making necessary to rationally respond to the evidence about bushfire. So the last time I gave a talk like this, it was actually in Gawler in South Australia a few years ago, following the fires there. And it does actually include some photos from both the Black Saturday fires and also from those fires. So this, obviously you've probably worked out, isn't actually Fryerstown, it's Hepburn Springs where I live. And this presentation, Disaster Resilient Landscapes and Communities, is also the title of a discussion paper that we wrote back in 2009 for our community, which there's a display copy there and is downloadable from our website. So I suppose the first thing, this idea of resilient landscapes, and I suppose when I started working on this sort of stuff back in the 70s, we were talking about bushfire resistant design, but that sort of really suggests this ability to just stop something, whereas in fact the term resilience, which has come to the fore in recent years, is very relevant in relation to fire, because fire, especially at that massive scale, is not a force that humans can just go like that and stop. So I think resilient landscapes are characterised by farms, forests and residential areas that can provide for people's local needs without excessive dependence on imported or complex technologies or resources. So in a way that's independent of bushfire, but it actually feeds into it. It can adapt to climate change, rising energy costs, economic stress without collapse, and recover from natural disasters, including bushfires. So in that broadest sense, that's what we hope, and that should be our aim for our landscapes. So just thinking of those three elements, the first one, actively managed forests, where the use and harvest reduces the risk and loss from bushfire and aids recovery. Now, if we were in Slovenia or Japan or Sweden, saying actively managed forests, we'd be saying, yes, well, yes, everyone does that. But in this country, we don't. We have this whole history, a difficult history in relation to our forests. That is actually a picture of Fry's forest, modest thinning of forest, which is not just for the purposes of making it more fire safe, but for actually improving it ecologically and improving future use values. We also need productive and sustainable farms that build the nutrient and water holding capacity of soil, because that's what's essential to sustain sustainable production, our ability to hold water and nutrients. And yet that's actually also a significant factor in the resistance to bushfire, because how full of water and nutrients a vegetation is actually a significant factor in whether it burns. And it's no accident that southeastern Australia, in the most infertile continent on the planet, is the most fire-prone region, because our vegetation has evolved in that low fertility and lack of water holding capacity. And any of us who have gardened in the goldfields know about that. Yes, the photo isn't actually of goldfield soil, it's Captain's Creek Organic Farm over at Blampede. And I think fire-resistant homesteads, gardens and residential zones are an achievable objective, even if in the larger landscape we have to work with what we've got. And so if those are managed to produce food and provide an amenable environment that's able to resist the impact of fire, then that gives people the confidence that houses as the ultimate refuge for residents that are able to survive and save key assets. Now, of course, that message is slightly different or maybe substantially different from the official message. So in terms of bushfire resilient settlement priorities, this is a graphic from the new book, Retro Suburbia. And of course, most of suburbia, bushfire is not a prime issue, but it's surprising the number of areas that are. And our little summary in that book of just looking at natural disasters, both flood, wind and fire, just trying to sort of summarise those. Where are the places? Where are you in the landscape? What are the hazards? And it's amazing, obviously fire is much more complex than flood in terms of predicting and understanding the risks. But it's amazing how many people even live in the suburbs and don't realise they're in a watercourse that now is all managed by stormwater. And oh, a wall of water came through the back door. Well, yes, you're in a valley. So that awareness of where you are is critical, and that shapes. And for some of us, that may mean maybe this is not a good place to be. You know, maybe we're actually completely in the wrong place. So I think recognising that houses are both prime assets and refuges, and this is, of course, one of the houses at Fryers Forest. So I am, I suppose, more comfortable in these sort of landscapes with the idea that any house is a refuge to survive fire if you are well prepared. But that a well-designed house where you are well prepared gives the psychological confidence that you are likely to act in a way that makes sense and don't do really stupid things. In the events that I did with Joan Webster, she pointed out that people's own responsibility in when they are in a house should be taken as an issue, not just was the house safe within that sort of fire context. Because what different people do is obviously very different. And a lot of the public messages are about what is the lowest common denominator, and then addressed to that. The fact that irrigated food gardens are fire-resistant barriers, and Jeanette, who was giving her experience in the 83 fires, I wasn't there at her talk last time, but she was telling me about their irrigated garden that didn't burn. Of course, we see that when it's food gardens, that water use, that nutrient use is justified at helping reinforce the house as a refuge. Not that it can be guaranteed it won't burn, but at least it's an asset. And I think that when we're dealing with bushfire-prone landscapes, that individual properties isolated from one another with separate infrastructure that we've been used to on freehold separate properties are actually a bit difficult from a number of points of view in terms of future sustainability. And that eco-villages and co-housing using owners corporation land tenure like exists at Fryers Forest, where there's privately owned houses and gardens but shared common land and infrastructure, and the possibility of community enterprises and collective capacity and response is a very significant difference. I mean, the water supply systems that we designed and built at Fryers Forest for a lower cost than what would be on all separate small properties gave some infrastructure capacity that, you know, for a given level of expenditure was more efficient by that collective. But there's also that social capacity that is there because people are actually bound together in an owner's corporation that are at least, you know, have some shared responsibilities. Now, of course, this is not the default way we live, but it is a way of thinking about what is reasonable settlement options for not the most extreme fire-prone areas, but certainly more fire-prone than towns and villages. Okay, another big controversial issue is fuel reduction burning. And I am quite a critic of the over-dependence on fuel reduction burning as a larger strategy in the landscape, but we do have to recognise that it's the only method available to quickly reduce fuel over large areas at low cost. And when I say large areas, I mean on the very large landscape. And I suppose there's a good photo of what I would consider a good fuel reduction burn, but there are a lot of problems because often fuel reduction burns ends up more like this, typically too hot. You get loss of soil carbon and nutrients, damage to trees and habitat, and then new fuel from fallen dry leaves and epicormic shoots, and sometimes you end up stimulating the dense regrowth of a new cycle of dense eucalypts, of more young trees, which is problematic. And that progressive dehydration of the landscape. So it's like that powerful tool, and yet there's the dangers in it becoming more and more addictive cycle as you move into a more and more desiccated landscape. So I want to briefly mention some of the alternatives to fuel reduction burning, especially as they occur at the small scale. There's the accelerated decomposition of fuels. You can reduce fuel by decomposing it. And we often don't think about that. And retaining fire retardant and low fire hazard trees, and the one I've already mentioned, ecological thinning of forests. So this accelerated decomposition to reduce brambles, litter, thinning slash from the tops of trees that have been thinned, and using people, animals and machines to do that job. So fire rakes, slash hooks and chainsaws combine with moisture and water flows. So using equipment that shreds or breaks things down and adding nutrients, especially nitrogen, phosphorus and calcium, which are the ones that really accelerate decomposition. And of course, fungi, microbes and worms. So these are tools that can be used. There's us on a working bee using minimal effort techniques in Spring Gully. We're bashing down the blackberries, not really getting rid of the blackberries, but just taking down that big canopy with all the dry canes underneath. In fact, the blackberry foliage is fire retardant. So a living ground cover of blackberry is actually less fire hazardous than grass. But it's all those dry canes that build up underneath over years and years, and even more so in a drier climate like Fryerstown than where we are in Hepburn. Getting it down on the ground in autumn, compacting it down, all those canes, which are quite small, start to decompose. And even if there's no decomposition, it's a fuel rearrangement in the same way that when you slash a paddock, you haven't taken any fuel away, but you've taken it from standing up to laying down. So of course, fuel rearrangement is well recognised as just as significant as fuel reduction. And this is a technique we developed as an alternative to both putting all the heads of trees in a pile and setting a light to it, or putting it through a chipper, which can be quite labour intensive, or gigantic machines, is to cut all the wood out of the heads of trees, so you're down to 40 mil wood, put it all together in a pile and then run through it with a chainsaw like you're making salad and it drops from this height to that. And then you put another lot on top and you keep doing it. Obviously, when you first do it, you don't touch the chainsaw on the ground. That's the trick. It can be fairly rough on chains, and you don't want big wood in there because it pinches on the bar. But it's amazing how much it reduces the air, and therefore if that's done when the material is green and fresh in the autumn, by the time you get to the next fire season, there's already a significant reduction. And a year or two later, it's mostly just compost, depending on the season. Goats and other grazing animals, of course, they're our goats on the public land, and there's increasing recognition that this is an alternative form of vegetation management that should be more widely used, especially along our creek corridors where, because goats are water-phobic, they don't, like cattle, just walk in wetlands and break down the banks of creeks. They're actually completely water-phobic, so they don't do that damage to the environment. And of course, they love all of this material. Physically, of course, animals are also breaking fuel down by trampling an addition of manure. And they turn the problems into solutions, milk and meat. So we call that blackberry-powered dairy products. We did a tour down the gully with the below our place with the North Central Catchment Management, and Sue gave them afternoon tea, and she said, "There's some milk from willow, blackberry." Of course. So, of course, this is those techniques that I've shown you seem a little bit fiddly and small scale, though in fact the decomposition one can be done on a larger scale. Of course, there is increasing use of mulching machinery that's specifically designed to actually grind up material or break it down, and things like the gorse groomers make a big difference to those sorts of fuels at a larger scale. So I think thinning all forests to reduce tree crowding and risk of crown fire around settlements is just a no-brainer. You know, like, why aren't we doing this? We tend to have this sort of like clear the trees back, create a sort of a dead zone, or at best, let's take a bulldozer in and sort of clear out between the trees. Oh, gee, we took the bark off that one. And, you know, surely we can do things that are a bit better than that and harvest firewood from the thin trees to help cover the costs and further reduce fuel levels. So that's us just thinning coppice regrowth, 3 regrowth box forest at Fryerstown. It's pretty simple. You just cut down the stunted, porous trees and you leave the biggest and the best ones. It's not rocket science. And those biggest and best trees actually have more moisture in their leaves than the stunted and stressed ones. And the stunted and stressed ones are often got new epicormic shoots coming out, which all contribute to ladder fuels if a big fire comes through. And that we can create new livelihoods actually thinning our dense regrowth forests. There's a wood gasifier that local engineer has worked on. There's technologies for using wood that we're not really making use of in this country. And even techniques like ring barking, techniques that, this is in higher rainfall forests, actually creating good dry wood and leaving most of the nutrients on the ground. And in that forest where that was done a few years ago, the jump in the growth of the trees was enormous. Big, healthy, crowned messmate stringy barks instead of the common sort of dense stands that you see everywhere. Okay, I think the other more perhaps long-term one is accepting that there are deciduous trees that shade out gorse, blackberry and grass fuels, accelerate the decomposition of litter and a low hazard and fire retardant in bushfires. And that we should be accepting some of these species rather than spending money trying to remove them. So the biggest one is the money that's been spent on willow removal in central Victoria and of course right across southeastern Australia. I've been on record for a long time as a critic that this is actually government expenditure damaging the environment, possibly the largest since the tax incentives to clear native forest, led to huge clearing in Queensland. It's an enormous backward step in my view. Now, of course, the whole how should willows be managed, it's a sort of complex issue, but just recognising that these species do shade out those more fire-prone vegetations that concentrate along our water environments, and they do shade out the big stands of phalaris and other dry grass fuels that tend to occupy those environments that you then have to cut or graze or burn or do something pretty much every year. So to move to some sort of closed canopy environments of mostly deciduous trees actually makes a lot of sense. So we've been working on this informal project, the Spring Creek Community Forest in Hepburn, which is a sort of an anarchistic, unfunded, unapproved, sort of permaculture-inspired version of land care that's been going on for 30 years in our gully. And there's a sort of working bee. There's Vern Howell, who was the initiator of that, and we've sort of been working together for a long time, mostly making tracks and maintaining access and really just assisting in processes that are happening naturally. Of course, these processes happen far faster in the higher rainfall areas and areas with urban stormwater runoff like we have. But some of the same principles apply here. I've been an advocate of planting and managing fire retardant species for a long time. This is a list that I've used, and it was something we mentioned in Permaculture 1 back in 1978, that not all vegetation is a hazard, some is an asset, and some of that is dependent on management, and some of it is the species. And you can see there's actually a lot of species there that are exotic species, but also native ones. Now, I can make this list available, but it's ridiculous putting up a lot of text on slides, but this is the fine print. Now, what I mean by that is there's a whole lot of provisos that mean you can't just sort of say, yep, that's a fire-safe species, we plant that. And that's one of the reasons why the CFA, I believe, has moved back from actually talking about any of this stuff, because it's too complex, it's too situation dependent. So now our well-managed grapevine right against our house is, under the conventional approach, is regarded as a fire hazard. But we say it's still a net fire benefit, apart from all the other benefits it gives us, as a ember barrier to embers getting potentially driven up into the house. But that depends on management. Yeah, there are lots of issues that make choice of vegetation and management important. I mentioned the stream corridors as whether these are hazards or assets. This is the Spring Creek Community Forest. That's all largely naturally occurring vegetation. And it's also environments that are flood resilient, because what we're getting with climate change is increased extreme storm events and increased extreme bushfire events. So we're getting both of those issues becoming more important. And some of these principles we have applied in consultancy projects. This was Harcourt Park in the middle of Bendigo. Some of these ideas were seen as too radical at the time to actually encourage these existing deciduous trees. And there is one way to manage existing willows along creeks is to pollard them back and feed them to animals and maintain the canopy rather than them all falling in the creek. Lastly, I just want to finish up with a few issues about resilient communities, and just to suggest that households, neighbourhoods and communities that can self-organise to provide for their needs without that excessive dependence on imported resources and complex technologies is a really important aspect to being able to then deal with the stress and disaster by pooling resources and cooperating. And resist the counterproductive tendencies to both scapegoat groups within the community or that over-dependence on centralised authority. The ways in which we do that, I think, are obviously complex, but I think it's really important in communities that are going to function well preventing disaster and responding to disaster is that we need to end the blame game. You know, it must be the greenies' fault. But we also need to discard failed landscape management ideologies, that nature must be left alone, that it just will somehow sort of work by itself. This was not an unmanaged landscape before Europeans came here. You know, we don't have any choice in any case. We must manage the environment. And I think that's one of the greatest failings on the environmental side, is this general ideology that somehow we shouldn't do that. But also the ridiculous suggestions that, you know, suddenly, you know, because some fuel reduction burn wasn't allowed in some place, that suddenly that's why some town burnt down. You know, it's nothing to do with that. You know, so those issues, and solve this greeny redneck divide that's in our own communities with practical solutions that bring the best of both sides together. And accept that we live in a changing world where if we're going to survive and thrive, we need to be creative and cooperative, and celebrate our stories of resilience. And maybe as an introduction to, or a precursor to Daryl, this is a photo I took of Daryl showing me around King Lake in the aftermath, and meeting Dave, who was an active defender at Kinglake, and going and staying in a place that was an oasis in a street where people cooperated and actively defended. And more recently, this was over in fires at Cuddly Creek in South Australia, and the permaculture community over there helping people re-establish burnt orchard irrigation systems. So I'll just end with a promo of some of the resources. I know Sue has Joan Webster's Essential Bushfire Safety Tips. We have a display copy of her fantastic book, The Complete Bushfire Safety Book. Everyone should really have that book who's in a fire-prone area. And our own two publications, The Flywire House and Retro Suburbia. This report is just freely downloadable from our website. I'll leave it there.